Welcome, everybody. I guess I should say welcome back to the second and final installment of the 2022 Brenda and David McLean lectures. My name is Bradley Miller. I'm the program chair in Canadian Studies here at UBC Vancouver on the traditional territories of the Musqueam people. And I want to welcome everyone that we've got in the room with us here tonight at Green College on the UBC campus, as well as everyone watching at home. In fact, I had a look at the RSVP list, and I think we've got people watching us at home tonight from across British Columbia and around the country. So I want to welcome everyone in person and everyone watching us via Panopto. I want to start, as I did last time, by thanking everyone here at Green College, especially Principal Mark Vesey and the academic programming manager, Alan Gumbach, for everything that they did to make this series possible. I also want to thank everyone at the Faculty of Arts who worked behind the scenes to get it going. And I want to thank, Brenda and David McLean for their 4 decades of commitment to UBC and to Canadian Studies in particular. We need to do a couple of things before we get going with the discussion. The first, which I almost forgot last time until Laura reminded me, was to remind people this is the ideal moment to turn your cell phones off or turn them on to vibrate. The second thing is the obligatory COVID preamble. As you know, UBC has maintained its mask mandate for indoor public spaces, so you are required to keep your mask fully on except when eating or drinking. The second thing is about the format for tonight. Our panelists, about which more in a moment, our panelists are going to present on and discuss some of the themes that Laura raised in her great lecture a couple of weeks ago. But once they've done that, we should have lots of time available for questions and answers and for audience ideas. And so when the presenters are done and you've got a question, just stick your hand up and Laura or one of the other panelists will call on you. For everyone who is watching online, I want to encourage them to ask questions and to participate in the Q&A too. So if you are watching online, and you want to ask a question, the thing to do, which you will have seen on the Green College events page, is to go to slido.com, that's SLIDO.com, and enter the code, which I'm going to get right this time after my mistake last time. You enter the code 956562. I've bolded it and underlined it, and I'm confident that this time I haven't made a mistake. So it's 956562. I'll have a look at it, and we'll be able to monitor the questions coming in from there. Now, we get to the good part. We get to why we're all here tonight. As I mentioned last time, when Laura and I were talking a few months ago about the format for these lectures, she had a really good idea. She wanted to do a public lecture in the tradition of the McLean lectures, but she also wanted to bring more voices, more perspectives into the discussion by hosting a panel on this overarching issue of art, activism, and environmental crisis. And I think we're really lucky to be here tonight with this exciting and accomplished panel that Laura recruited as part of this great idea. They are going to position themselves in a second, or I understand that they will position themselves in a second, but in case, as often happens, they don't adequately hype themselves up, I am going to do that for them for a moment, and then we will be done with me and we will get on to the panel discussion. So, as we did last time, let's hold our applause till the very end so no one feels more popular than anyone else. Let's start with the McLean Chair Emeritus, Dr. Laura Moss. Laura is Professor of English here at UBC. She has taught about and supervised dissertations on and published work on a huge array of issues in Canadian and world literature. Her recent work includes pieces on literature and the environment, the state of CanLit in a highly turbulent period, as well as a piece that I suspect many of us in this room should run out and read ASAP, that piece being called An Editor's Advice, How to Increase Your Chances of Publication in an Academic Journal. And on that note, I should say she is very well positioned to be doling out advice. She is the editor or co-editor of 5 books. She's also the recently retired editor of the journal Canadian Literature. And I also want to draw attention to the fact that she is doing really important work right now in a really demanding period as Associate Dean of Students in the Faculty of Arts. So, Dr. Laura Moss. Next, we have Dr. Warren Cariou. Warren is professor in the Department of English, Theatre, Film, and Media at the University of Manitoba. He's the author of 2 books, The Exalted Company of Roadside Martyrs and Lake of the Prairies, A Story of Belonging, the latter of which won the Drainey Taylor Biography Prize. As if this weren't enough, he's also a filmmaker. In fact, Warren has directed and co-produced 2 films about Indigenous people in the oil sands region. Those films are Overburden and Land of Oil and Water. And as if that weren't enough, in 2014, he also began undertaking a new photographic practice called petrography, in which he uses bitumen gathered from the banks of the Athabasca River in the tar sands. Next, we have Dr. Stephen Collis. Stephen is professor in the Department of English at Simon Fraser University. He has published a dozen, and let's take a moment to marvel at that, dozen books of poetry and prose. He's received the Dorothy Livesay Poetry Prize, the Latner Writers' Trust Prize, the Latner Writers' Trust of Canada Prize, and I love the name of this, the Nora and Ted Sterling Prize in Support of Controversy. Maybe he will be willing to make a little of this tonight. And finally, we have Dr. Rita Wong. Rita is professor in the Faculty of Culture and Community at Emily Carr. She's the author or co-author of 6 books. So again, frankly, another inspiring and intimidating body of work. And her work has been recognized also with the Dorothy Livesay Prize, as well as the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop Emerging Writer Award. And in fact, her 2007 book, Forage, was a finalist for the Asian American Literary Award. It won the Livesay Prize, and it won Canada Reads Poetry 2011. So, that's all for me. That's all I want to say. Please join me in welcoming this great panel. Thanks, everybody.
All right, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming to this second McLean lecture. I'm really delighted that you're here joining us. If it's for the first time, welcome, and if you're coming back, welcome back. Before we jump in, I do really want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded ancestral territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I'm really grateful to be in this land, in this space, in this long, long tradition of knowledge keeping and engagement with where we are. And I live and work in this territory, and it's a very important community to be part of. And as I say, I acknowledge, recognize, and just have great gratitude for being here. The goal of the session today is to have a lively conversation with us. So that's our mission, lively conversation about how and why artists, writers, scholars, critics, creative thinkers have addressed serious issues around the climate emergency, but also around other urgent issues. We go beyond the climate emergency here. So as Bradley said, the format is that we'll each make some opening remarks, and then I'll lead us in a series of questions. Each panelist has also brought a question, and they'll have an opportunity to ask that, and then we'll open it up to the floor, either through the Slido thing or the room thing. So on March 2nd, I began with a few points of departure, givens, and I'm just going to reiterate those here. So one is I'm not debating whether we're in a climate emergency. We are. For me, one of the key issues that I'm really engaged in is thinking about old growth forests and how they need to be protected. I'm really fascinated by thinking about how writers and artists have long been commentators on society, and so I'm thinking about this, as I said last time, as part of a really long and engaged history of artists who have been public commentators. And fourth, I think it's important to think about this in the Canadian context as a dynamic space for resistance and reconstruction. Although the issues we're dealing with are global, the legislation, the policies, the history of this particular space is particular to where we are. So we can think locally, nationally, and internationally at the same time. So I want to begin by just noting my three main questions. These are the questions, the research questions I have that drive pretty much all my work. And they are: who speaks for whom, who listens, and who profits? These questions are really relevant here tonight. Who gets a chance to speak? Whose voices are heard, right? Who is silenced? Who chooses to be silent? Who's listening? Who's not listening, right? The question of audience is very important to me. Who profits from speaking? Who benefits? Who benefits differently? And who doesn't? Who is adversely affected by speaking? So really, I like to think about what we do with stories, but stories as speech, stories as communication, as engagement with important issues. So in my lecture the other evening, I noted how creative activism takes many forms, right? Individually and in collectives, and how it spans words, sounds, images, creative use of natural materials. It goes to blockades, protests. It's multiplicitous, and it has varying levels of force and efficacy. So we're going to be talking about that tonight, what the efficacy is, what the force is, and the whole range. The panel that I brought together tonight, and I am so grateful to you all for being here. Thank you for joining me. I actually invited these guys to come last summer, and we were to originally do this in October, but we decided to postpone it. So I'm doubly grateful for your agreeing to come in October and again, re-upping and coming in March. So thank you. Activism for some is, as I said the other night, it's a gentle coming to knowledge, right? Sometimes it looks like a kind of meditation on interconnectedness, and I spoke about Ruth Ozeki briefly around this kind of framework. Other times it's about a respect of the land and water and our movement on it. Other times it's a kind of generous humility and thinking about being humble to various forms of knowledge and history, and thinking about the long history of violence, settler colonial violence, and well beyond in this space, and the relationship between that and resource extraction. And a recognition and acknowledgement of knowledge keepers who've worked at protecting the environment sustainably for years. Activism for others, though, we know is more overt, embedded in artistic practice. It's often embedded in physical action as well. So I'm thinking, as I said before, about protests and blockades, but communal marches, sit-ins, teach-ins, performances, and also conversations. So I think that this is also activism because we're here, we're engaging, we're thinking through, and we're thinking together. So thank you for being here to think together about this. So tonight with this panel, I want to consider a range of ways that creators have acted out of necessity, as Rita has advocated, creatively in response to the changing environment, to the climate crisis, and well beyond. I am, again this evening, guided by Dionne Brand's words, thinking about an inventory of our times. As she said, I have nothing soothing to tell you. That's not my job. My job is to revise and revise this bristling list hourly. So what does that inventory of environmental art look like? We talked about this before, but I want to bring it back here. What is the role of art in the climate emergency? That's what we're here to think about. It is, as I said, to pay attention, to recognize, to acknowledge, to raise awareness, to warn about possible consequences, to highlight environmental concerns. But it's also to act, to unsettle expectations, to ask questions and not necessarily answer them. It's really about thinking about imagining alternative futures, futures that might be in crisis and disaster and despair or not. It's to think through possibilities and speculate, to make an audience uncomfortable, to live with discomfort, right? We're in an uncomfortable time. We should be uncomfortable. We should be moved to do something. It's to think about what we do with that moving. To think about what the role of affect is, what the role of emotion is in this as well. To listen to many voices and to listen to a diversity of voices. To think about stories in different ways. To consider what it means to listen and to ask, as I mentioned over and over again the other night, what if? Because, as you know, I love that phrase. So, as I think it's very clear that we are above raising awareness, we need to push further. As writers revise and as the world warms, what do we do? So, that's what we're here for. I want to turn it over to Warren to start us off with a discussion of just yourself and your practice, and take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Laura. Okay, hope that's working. Thanks. It's an absolute honor to be here on Musqueam territory and to share a conversation with these amazing artists that I've admired their work so much for so long. And to talk about an issue that is just so crucial to me and I think to all of us. I come from a place called Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, and it's just in the acid rain shadow of the tar sands, I guess you could call it. I grew up there not really understanding what was going on, not too far from my home. And it was really only a lot later that I started to go there to actually visit and see what was happening to the land there. And so my work has some sort of circulated back to the tar sands in a number of ways, and my connections to the Métis community through my father and his family has made me think about the land in different ways in relation to that. And I've got some images here that I'd like to show just in relation to one aspect of my work. So if I could get the projector connected here, I'll quickly go through these. But basically, what I started as Bradley mentioned, writing and making films about Indigenous communities in the tar sands affected by, directly by having this mining happening on their territory and being affected by the pollution. Sorry, it's right on the side there. And I've always felt that there was something else to be said. There was more and more to be said about this topic that I couldn't really encompass, or that I could not sort of fully get at the magnitude of it. But actually, as I spent more time in the region, I actually learned something, I guess maybe a little more mundane, but what became more profound for me was experiencing the bitumen on the land in its natural form, because we tend to think about the tar sands in terms of it being the largest industrial operation on the earth, which it is, as a planetary wound. But the tar actually exists in a natural state that is, I think, beautiful, and I think this is something that we don't normally think about. And so I happened upon this scene, and I was amazed at the beauty and the sensory richness of this scene. And so it sent me on a different trajectory. And I started thinking about, could I interact with this material in a different way than how we normally do in our daily lives, where it's omnipresent but also sort of absent from our view. So I long story, but I ended up making photographs with this material. And it's slightly photosensitive, so it takes about 16 hours to make a photograph. But here is one of them that is a depiction of one of the tailings ponds at Syncrude. So the material is bitumen, and the tailings pond is also containing bitumen. But what I want to mostly talk about today is how I had to learn how to relate to this material in a different way, to think about it as something that I would have intimate contact with. And we tend to think about petroleum as something that we don't want to have intimate contact with, but we always do. And we just, it's insulated away from us. So I ended up going out into the land in various places on the edge of the Athabasca River and finding these seeps of bitumen where it's naturally occurring in the forest. And this was to use in my photographic practice, but I also just was so amazed at the aesthetic qualities of this material, the beauty of it, and the fact that it seems to be actually supporting life. Plants are growing on it. Animals are passing through it. There's in some of these images, there's pollen from trees collected in it, and so it's a natural part of the environment. And that, to me, is just something that we don't think about with petroleum. So trying to reestablish an intimate connection to it was something that's been important for me in my work and in my sort of attempt to come to terms with the tar sands. And so I really think that in petromodernity or in our modern society, we have instituted all of these ways of insulating ourselves away from the structures and the processes that create our energy or that bring our energy to us in a way that seems unconnected to us. Sorry, that is a bitumen just seeping up from the ground, and there's a cranberry plant that's poking up through. So so there's a white fringe on that flower there. It was amazing to me that this is what it looks like in the forest. But of course, this is where other aspects of the forest are being destroyed. And this is just a few hundred meters from that picture that I just showed you. Clear cutting, and this is a different kind of process where they're not going to strip mine, but they're going to inject steam down into the ground. And so I had started visiting these places and trying to honor the forest that's there, honor the land that's there, and so leaving offerings there to do that. And the same in some of these other locations. And then when I did gather the bitumen that I used for my petrographs, I just left an offering there as well. So sweetgrass, that's been what I've done as a gesture of reciprocity when I'm taking this very small amount of bitumen from the forest and utilizing it in a very different way from how it is normally used in petromodernity. So I don't want to go on too much longer at this point, but I just wanted to sort of introduce you to this, what I've learned from the bitumen, I guess, is what I would want to say. That the intimacy of the connection that I have with this material, which I know is toxic, but I've learned other things about it, and I guess I've learned other things from it. And I think if we can start to think about how our energy sources, we are all intimately connected to them, but we're being inculcated to think otherwise. And so I'm really trying to think about how we can reestablish that sense of intimacy, and not just with our energy sources, but with the land in a broader way. So I'll just leave with a couple of other images of other petrographs that I've made using the bitumen. And this one is actually a photograph of some plants that were in the place where the bitumen itself was gathered. So maybe just stop there for now. Turn it over to Stephen, I guess.
Thanks, Warren. That was really wonderful. So I live on the traditional ancestral territory of the Tsawwassen people. I work in Burnaby for the most part on the territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Katzie and Coquitlam, and we keep expanding that list as we realize the complexity that we're occupying. I guess I've always, part of writing, and I've been writing a long time, has always been about thinking about the natural world in some way. My family on both sides came in the late 19th century from different parts of England and Scotland to Vancouver Island to work in and around the coal mining industry. I grew up on Vancouver Island, and part of growing up there for me was a lot of time spent in a canoe with my father on rivers, lakes, and the ocean as often as we could. I'm the youngest of 7, and I don't think my father got to do that when there were so many around, but once it whittled down to one kid left in the house, I got the benefit from going out with him into the bush all the time. All I'm going to do is talk really quickly about 3 recent books and the different ways they're engaging with some of the questions we have here before us today, and then just a couple quick words, if I have time, about art and activism. So the first one I'll talk about, and which Laura mentioned in her talk very generously, thank you, Laura, is a book called Decomp. It's a collaborative book I wrote with Jordan Scott, another local poet. It came out in 2013, and it's the impetus here was Jordan and I were both feeling cranky at that time. This is in the first decade of the present century, and cranky about what was being called conceptual poetry at the time, and there were a bunch of white dudes really excited about this idea of conceptual poetry, and a lot of young writers excited, and Jordan and I found it very uninteresting what was happening under that rubric of conceptual poetry. And we were both, people who spent a lot of time outdoors, and we were also kind of dissatisfied with how eco-poetry was being talked about at the time. For one thing about it, it seemed to lack a materiality that we were both interested in. So the very simple gestural project we came up with was to leave identical copies of Darwin's Origin of Species outside for a year in 5 different ecosystems around the province, collect them after a year, and just see what, the land, what that particular ecosystem had to say about the book, how that ecosystem read the book, and what we could read of that or interpret of its interpretation of Darwin, if that makes any sense. And they were very different, from the obliterated and unreadable to the very microscopically rearranged. So you had these incredible poems being written by words being rejumbled as the book was nibbled on by mice, let's say. In 2016, I published a book called Once in Blockadia. It's got some artwork that is also on the cover of, or the same artist anyway, on the cover of Rita Wong and Fred Waugh's book Beholden. It's work made by Genevieve Robertson using bitumen and other carbon materials to make beautiful prints. That book is kind of documentary poetry, comes out of climate justice movement, pipeline resistance, etc. Really, it's anchored by 2 walks, or 2 places of localities of walking. One, walking in the actual tar sands in 2014. I think Rita was there too. We participated in the tar sands healing walk, which had been going on for maybe 5 years at that point, actually, where you literally walk maybe right by that Syncrude refinery that Warren had up here. And then walking, again, sometimes with Rita, in and around Burnaby and Coquitlam, along the route of the existing Trans Mountain pipeline and parts where it would vary and change with the new pipeline that's slowly being built. And then lastly, my most recent book, A History of the Theories of Rain, which comes out of a period of kind of pulling back from frontline activism, in part through a desire to sit with things like grief and despair that I was feeling and really try and understand them. Things that I wasn't really engaging with, I realized, when one thing I was doing was being a spokesperson a lot of the time and quoting things about climate change and IPCC reports, et cetera, to the media, but not really ever taking those things in, not taking the time to take what those things were saying in, and I kind of wanted to sit with that. But the other thing that happened as a kind of a change in practices, I suppose, was so myself and 4 other people were sued by Kinder Morgan. And so that prompted a bit of a recoil and a withdrawal. But at that exact moment, I had an invitation to go to England to participate in a project around refugees, asylum seekers, and immigration detainees that people I knew in England were organizing. And to come and to write something, present something I had written, but also participate in a week-long walk with those people. And that was kind of life-changing. And I think I've been doing that work for 7 years now, I suppose. And I go every year for part of the summer. But even the last 2 years with the pandemic, I've been even more involved because everything's been online anyway. So suddenly I can actually be an organizer in what's going on with that community. It's very different stakes, because you're not confronting an emergency in the same way, in a sense, because nothing is changing. as long as there are conservative governments in the UK, and especially since with Brexit, there is probably not going to be movement on this issue. That is, the UK indefinitely detains people. They're deprived of any kind of rights, but they're stuck in a state of limbo. They can neither leave the country nor productively stay in the country. They can't work or do anything. So you have literally tens of thousands of people in the UK who have come fleeing horrible situations, who are trapped and can't do anything. And there's almost no hope to change the law. So it's become a community where you're simply trying to support these people, and provide the things the government's not providing, essentially, for a community of people. I've always had an eye to in thinking about climate change and climate refugees in the background of that. Almost no one I've met says, oh, climate change is what drove me out of my country. But what drove them out of their country typically was war, or essentially tribal strife is what it really comes down to. And those things are occurring because of long-term drought and climate-driven failures. So it's an indirect kind of thing that's happening. I'm probably talking way too long about all that. So really briefly about, is it all good? A couple more minutes? Okay. I can't remember when I started. A little bit about art and activism, I guess. And I'll just read a little bit because I'm not going to remember what I was trying to say. When we bring these two things together, art and activism, I think we highlight a more fundamental problem, a rift between saying and doing, word and world, in this time of fake news, and this time when a word like action is just abused by, well, especially in the sort of public media sphere, in policy discussions, in anything politicians say. I mean, Trudeau says he's taking climate action by buying and building a pipeline, so we know what kind of action he's taking. But what does that word mean? And so every time I hear it, I can only turn to Greta Thunberg and say blah, 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 blah. The word feels so meaningless coming out of those mouths. Okay, I think we're constantly slipping back into a conceptual space shaped by the disconnection between words and things, speech and acts, a very old Cartesian problem we seem to keep perpetuating, and which I think poetry, I want to claim this anyway, almost always militates against that separation of word and action. So despite someone like W.H. Auden saying, poetry makes nothing happen, I want to turn to, I was trying to remember Austin's name, J.T. Austin, J.L. Austin? Anyway, how to do things with words. J.L., thank you. Poetry's always been about how to do things with words, not that it does not make something happen. And Austin talks about performativity. So I'm going to perform a very short coda to a poem right now, and I'll stop there. And it's I'm going to swear a lot, so close your ears if you don't want to hear that, or live stream, can we bleep? But anyway, it's the coda to a long poem called Come the Revolution, which repeats this phrase, come the revolution, and says other things over and over and over again, and very, very fast, and then it draws up short at the end. Come the revolution, shit will no longer be fucked up in bullshit. And that which is loving in our hands will touch that which is loving in each and every other's hands. And while reading this poem, still won't be the same as storming a bank, oil refinery, or parliament. You may yet be reading this poem to a room full of people with whom you'll presently be storming a bank, oil refinery, or parliament. So it matters, performance matters and context matters, I guess is what I want to say. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Steve. I might just move this over into here. Just give me a second. Okay. Okay. I was in a talk earlier today, and Nayeli Jimenez was saying the role of the artist is to make revolution irresistible. And that's a quote from Tony Cade Bambera. That's certainly part of the work, for sure. I just want to share a little bit of my journey, which has been over the last decade or so, working with water and being here on Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish lands in so-called Vancouver. My work has been, how do we uphold Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish laws? How do we uphold Indigenous laws, which were here before any of us arrived on these shores? And how do we learn from the land and the water? And when I use the term land, I include water in that these days. But this image here is a canoe ceremony in the Burrard, so-called Burrard Inlet, with the Tsleil-Waututh, or the people of the inlet. Steve might have been there that day, I don't know. And I've been grateful over the years to participate in different ceremonies and to stay with that question of how do we uphold Coast Salish law. And Reuben George talks about how we have a reciprocal relationship with the land, so how do we reciprocate? And he talks about Coast Salish law in terms of truth, family, health, and culture. And the Tsleil-Waututh have done amazing work over the last while, including a 1,200-page assessment of the Kinder Morgan, now Trans Mountain pipeline. And they've been doing the work that colonial governments have failed to do. They've been upholding the responsibility to protect the land and the waters for future generations. And I come into this story very late in the game. It's very late, but I hope not too late, to be a better relative than what colonization would have allowed. So about a decade ago, this is about 10 years ago at Emily Carr on the Granville Island campus, and we organized an event called Downstream, Dorothy, Christian, and myself. That's the Miracle in the Red. Lee was part of that gathering, and Lee said very loudly and clearly at that gathering that water belongs to itself. We have this idea that we somehow own these things, and actually we just need to learn to respect them and be careful about how we impact them. So that journey has led me up and down Statlu, also known as the Fraser River. Years ago, this is the headwaters, visiting the river, just spending time with it, finding this warning that there's a pipeline going under the river. This is over a decade ago. And here we are in Burnaby Mountain, 2014, with all that happened to Steve, 2018, with me getting arrested, and spending time in jail, and basically returning, coming out of jail fine, and jail's not the end of the world. Jail is scary, but climate crisis is actually way scarier. And I think we need to take this emergency really seriously. I always say to my students, when you're on the Titanic, it's not helpful to panic. You got to stay calm. You got to work together to build lifeboats, and you have to either change this steering of the ship, which is going in the wrong direction right now. That's one thing, and that's storming the banks in the ship and all of that. But the other piece of it is building what we need, and that is already here. That's the good news. The Kwakwaknuktuk, which is the Coast Salish Watch House, is built on top of the pipeline at the east gate of the Trans Mountain tank farm. And you see that yellow post there in the front of the picture. Those yellow posts run all the way from Alberta to down here into Burnaby. And they basically mark where the pipeline is underground. And so in order for this pipeline to expand, triple its capacity from the tar sands, it has to go through this watch house. So far, it has not done that. And so there's a lot of different activities. That watch house was built in 2018, a march of about 5,000, 10,000 people put it up, and there has been action throughout. It's a project I was involved with called 1308 Trees, basically for the trees that are being cut down by the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We've been documenting what's happening with the trees being taken out at an alarming rate. People have been putting themselves in trees. This is one of the tree sits that happened. People were up in trees for months. Just last week or the week before, an 80-year-old came out of jail for blocking machinery that was trying to build the pipeline. So stuff is still going on, whether or not you hear about it in the media. Some of you might have seen what happened with the hummingbirds. They stopped tree clear cutting for about 4 months last year because of citizen action, basically, reminding the federal government that they have environmental laws they're supposed to be protecting. So what I'm seeing is like laws being used against people like me, and also for the interests of Trans Mountain. So, there's a disproportionate amount of police force against peaceful land defenders at the moment. But the work continues. This is just a group called Protect the Planet, Stop TMX. Their website is stoptmx.ca. and they have been basically following what's going on and alerting people to things. So there's been a drilling under the Fraser River down here, and then Trans Mountain realized it made a mistake. Remember the GPS coordinates? And then they have to re-drill. And, there's no regulatory scrutiny that is actually meaningful at this point. They ask for whatever they want, and they get it from the Canada Energy Regulator. So it's really distressing to watch all of this going on, but it's also really important to not give up and to not look away. So at the end of the day, people are like, well, how do you keep going when it's so depressing and all of that? And I'm like, well, as long as the creeks are still flowing down the mountain and the watch house is still there and people are like, the Coast Salish peoples here have survived so much. I can't even begin to say how much. So I have no right to be giving up just yet. So there's a lot of work to do, and I want to encourage everybody to find a way to do something to help stop that pipeline. And just briefly around Natsamat and that sense of interconnectedness, Natsamat translates roughly as one heart, one mind, one spirit, that we're all related somehow and connected. And that means the land and the water and the plants and the animals and all of it. If the salmon die out, so do we. And so over the years, I've also tried to think about connecting to other places. I just came back from a visit up to the Wet'suwet'en Yinta, up to the Unistoten Healing Center, where the Wedson Kwa, this river here, is so clean you can still drink out of it, directly out of the river. You don't have to chlorinate it, you don't have to treat it, and that water is part of me. And part of the people who are defending it so strongly. And I just want to acknowledge the work that they've been doing up there. I'm writing a piece for Rabble that should be out on World Water Day on Tuesday about this. And I've also, every summer, gone up to the Peace Valley in northeastern BC, up near Fort St. John. What first brought me up there was a project called Decolonizing Water. I was up there for a Decolonizing Water bush camp. And I happened to just by accident be there when BC Hydro started cutting down trees that had eagles' nests in them. And the local people came together and had a river ceremony, which Dorothy and I went to. And I have basically tried to renew my commitment to stopping that dam somehow, every which way that I can. And I'm certainly open to ideas and suggestions. But the Paddle for the Peace was happening back then when the river was still accessible. So I've gone up to just learn, pay attention. I want to acknowledge that the Blueberry River First Nation recently had a very important legal victory. And, whether or not we live on those territories, Treaty 8 is part of BC, and as such, if we live in BC, we have a responsibility to uphold that treaty. This is an image of the WAC Bennett Dam, which powers roughly a third of the electricity we use through BC Hydro. So, this lighting, this mic, I acknowledge that work, that violence that has happened, because that flooded an enormous area and traumatized a whole bunch of people and places and land and animals. And I think we all have a responsibility today to prevent that from happening again, which is why I go up there, I spend time up there, I witness the destruction, as well as the resilience of the earth. That area that was mulched in the previous slide, that's what it looked like a year later. So that land is very amazing and fertile, and it can heal if we work with it, if we don't kill it. But this is what's happening on a massive scale right now, is clear cutting. This is, just to give you the scale, that's me in front of one of those slash piles. Like, there's just an enormous amount of clear cutting, roughly the length of Vancouver to Whistler, right? The whole corridor, that is something we can't afford to be losing right now. And so this is an eagle's nest that was taken down by BC Hydro. It weighs about 1,000 pounds. It is larger than all of those men trying to rip apart this valley. There have been 2 landslides down near where the Site C Dam is trying to be built. And, I'm just waiting for the next landslide. I have no faith in governments at all at this point, but I still have faith in the land and in the water, that the land itself is speaking and we need to listen to it. So this is one of the elders from West Moberly. They're in court soon to stop the dam. And, whether it's up there or down here, I think that sense of interconnectedness of Natsamat is what I want to return to. And so I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Whew. Thank you, all 3 of you, for your opening comments. Warren, for talking about there's so much overlap in what you were talking about here, right? Warren talking about intimacy of the connection with bitumen and discovering that intimacy, right? Rita talking about that resilience of the earth and the concept of healing and how do we reciprocate the land and the law, together. Stephen talking about the materiality of the environment through the various forms of walking and engaging in the space. And that poetry militates against separation of words and worlds. I love that. And the idea that the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. Is that it? That's a good motto, a life lesson. I want to pick up on this, and Rita, I want to go back to you because in your poetry, you write about a lot of what you've been talking about here, but you do it so incredibly creatively with language. And the way that you use language to tell these stories and you manipulate language, you play with language, but you also you use a lot of juxtaposition in your poetry. You use a lot of scientific terms beside non-scientific terms. You do this. Can you talk a little bit about your poetry and the way your poetics has developed in parallel to the work you're talking about here?
Thank you for that question, because I haven't been writing a lot of poetry lately.
Okay.
I've been writing a lot of essays. But that said, it's funny. My first book of poetry was called Monkey Puzzle, and the editor, Claire Harris, was a poet, African-Canadian poet in Calgary, who gave me a bit of advice, and she was an excellent editor, but she was also like, don't let them call you an activist. was her advice, and her advice was like, because that means you got to do the work and everybody else doesn't. And so the advice was just kind of like, remember that it's, you don't have to take everything on, for everybody else. And that was, I think, good advice, even though I couldn't always follow it. And in terms of the work, though, the innovation or the mixing of things, I feel like I live in a world where a lot of things are colliding together all the time. There's a lot of dissonance. There's a lot of contradictions. And I think poetry is really a good way to work through that in a way that hopefully helps other people to work through it as well, in terms of sharing that journey. I've been struggling a lot with that sense of question of, people ask about, well, do you have hope? And I'm kind of like, I don't really think I have hope in the sense that I think things are going to improve in the way I want them to improve. But I have hope in the sense that there are a lot of people doing amazing work that need to keep doing it and that need to stay connected and committed to that work. So I have hope in the sense of that sense of there's work to be done, unconditional rather than, say, instrumental in the outcome, maybe. Yeah.
Because Warren and Steve, you are both poets as well, so I wanted to...
Well, I want to respond to Rita, but just because I have been reading, for instance, Undercurrent recently. Maybe you haven't read it so recently. But one thing really struck me, and I've taught that book a number of times, and I often focus on moments in it that are, well, exactly what you were saying, Laura, about science, but moments where protest is being directly invoked. But what, in the last rereading, one thing that really struck me is there's a series of untitled prose poems that run through the book. It's probably 7 or 8 of them. They're not titled. They just periodically appear. And they're all sentences that begin with the word we. And they're already examinations of what the boundaries of we-ness are. And because I'm thinking a lot about ontology, and part of what I was getting at about words and worlds is that we've got a screwed up ontology. We need to go there. It's one of the million things we need to do is to rethink how we actually conceive and talk about our relationship to the world, which still is ridiculously separated. When, as Rita says, the water is inside us. We're not separate. But those explorations of our unseparateness in Undercurrent are just marvelous. So it's just like a book club recommendation is what that is.
Thanks, Steve. Oh, just one quick thing. That question, who speaks for whom? I would love to change it to who speaks with whom.
Yes. Okay. Yes, good point.
I just want to join in, and I think that some of the things that you were mentioning, Rita, about resilience of the land that really resonated for me one of the times that I went to the tar sands was just the year after the huge fire, and it was amazing because we went into Fort McMurray and whole neighborhoods were still completely razed, right? Nothing had been rebuilt. But we went into the forest and the trees were 4 or 5 feet high already. It was amazing. And so that was just inspirational to me to see that the land could regenerate that quickly after something that seemed cataclysmic, that seemed almost apocalyptic at the time. And so you talk about also the elders talking about how we can learn from the land. And I think that's just such a great example of that. And maybe that's where, I think we've all been talking a little bit about just being out on the land, the Tar Sands Healing Walk, or being, as you've talked about, going with your students on the rivers, and Stephen, you talked about that as well. I don't know if you have anything else to add about that, just being out in the land, whether we think of that, the urban space as being the land as well, and how that, I guess, can serve as an inspiration for the kind of work that we want to do.
That's a great question. I didn't have time, but in terms of what's in so-called Vancouver, there's over 50 buried streams, right? Those creeks that were full of salmon just like a couple hundred years ago, those ghosts are haunting us, I think, when I walk through the city. I've been part of a project to try to daylight one of those creeks, and I don't think we're going to be jackhammering the cement anytime soon, but we have managed to get it built into the capital plan of the city. It's called the St. George Rainway, which needs renaming too. But the Rainway is basically removing some of the cement and increasing more of that green space on the street. So Leanne Simpson puts it really well when she says, if your mother's being hurt or abused, you don't give up on your mother, right? Like, the city is land, absolutely. Like, there's a lot of healing that needs to happen here. And as somebody who grew up in Calgary, pretty disconnected from the land, like if you drop me in a forest, I won't survive. I think that you can still learn to connect by paying attention to wherever you are, right? And listening and just learning about the history of that land.
There's a book, isn't there, Rita, that shows all the original creeks and rivers of Vancouver. Yeah, and it goes like a map. Yeah, it's beautiful. And Roger Farr, another poet, and I don't know, ages ago, 20 years ago, maybe, or close to it, used that map and followed some creeks through Vancouver, and it was amazing because you didn't know, and we would lift manholes and covers, and it was just like you could hear it roaring underground in the middle of the street. You had no idea it was there on the surface, which is really fascinating. That question, I guess about the land, what I wanted to go back to just really briefly is that regeneration, which is so true, except that there's clearly ways in which human activity can prevent that from happening. I think of the treelessness of lots of England. And that's thousands of years of removal of the original forest cover, but then, keeping sheep on it all the time and animals that keep it nibbled down. And then the things that happen when there aren't plants there, soil gets washed away. And we've seen the results of some of this here in BC with their recent atmospheric river in November, where the floods were so, and the landslides and the road washouts were so severe because it came on the heels of forest fires, which had, wiped out the forests. Then the trees weren't there to hold the soil. Then massive amounts of rain come in, the soil washes down. This is how you get environments where nothing seems to grow much anymore. So, yeah, nature will bounce back. And it will bounce back even after everything we've done. But sometimes it's a longer bounce back because of what we continue to do.
I have a question for Warren, but Rita, about 12 years ago, when we celebrated Canadian Literature's 50th anniversary, you gave a talk, I think, where you said you had this image of, I think you said, every time you see a crack in the sidewalk, you have hope. And that has stayed with me for so long because it's nature responding to what we've put on top of it, and so it cracks. So for the last 12 years, every time I see a crack, I cheer. So I just spend my life cheering because we need some, street resurfacing. But so thank you for that image, actually, just really what you're talking about now and the streams underneath, but has made me think of that and rethink of, where nature is asserting its voice. And I think about that with decomp, right? Like putting the books in the environment and seeing how the land has responded, or those ecosystems have responded differently, or taking bitumen and creating photographs out of it, right? Like this focus on materials, and as you said, materiality for concept poetry, to actually forget the materiality of the space in which the poet is existing, it's very much what each of you do differently, but really distinctly think about that relationship, because it often comes with a responsibility, right? When you recognize materiality, you recognize responsibility to that place as well, and your movement within it. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and ask you, Warren, who your audience is for your petrographs. When you were creating those, what were you thinking in terms of who would you like to see these? Where do you want to bring that conversation? Because when we talk about art and activism, however activism is defined, thinking about audience is important. So who speaks, who listens, and who profits? So who were you thinking about listening? So who is listening there? And I wonder if we could, Rita, if we could turn this off so that we could, because then we can push this up and it might be, yeah.
Yeah, that's really a sort of a complicated question for me in a way, because when I first started working with the bitumen, I didn't really believe that it would work. I didn't think that a photograph would actually be created. And so more really what I was doing was I was just playing with this material.